used quite frequently. I would hope, I mean, that the forthcoming referendum in Brazil would succeed. And so equally, I would hope. But you have a very, 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 very powerful armaments lobby, which doesn't mean they can't be defeated. I think, I mean, that one of the awful things is the fact that, I mean, so much of the export of arms is to countries, frequently very poor countries, who have governments that are violators of human rights. So yes. Yeah.
What is the most challenging aspect of working with governments, especially getting them to mobilize?
Working with governments.
Yes. Working. What's the most challenging aspect? What is the most challenging aspect?
Working with
No,
governments.
when you oppose governments.
Oh, I see.
Yes.
It's to remain loyal to yourself because governments are very powerful and it's very challenging to oppose a government and one doesn't take that on quite easily. I mean, you think twice before you actually come public upon your disagreement with the government.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Do you think that when injustices are being done, such as female genital mutilation, really anything, but that could be the example, in the name of culture, that other cultures have the right or responsibility to interfere?
Well, the trouble is with culture like that, many people don't think that it's an injustice. I mean, if you've grown up knowing nothing else, you don't realize that, my human rights are being violated. So I would think that before other cultures come in, they should come in the educative side, start to educate people about their human rights. You can't come in just say to me, you're take for instance my case. I'm a Xhosa woman, and as a Xhosa woman, I'm expected to cover my head most of the time. And if you came in and told me that, you have a right to walk bareheaded, so your human rights are being violated, I might take exception to that. And yet, if I'm educated about it, I might agree with you.
I agree with her.
Not very often.
It's safer. But maybe just to add is the fact that sometimes people do use their culture as an excuse for continuing violations of human rights, and they say don't come and interfere. We do things this particular way, and therefore human rights activists must always be vigilant that that is not an argument that is used. Of course, I mean, for a very long time in your culture, they used to say woman's place is in the home, and you said that was culture. You shouldn't want to do men's work. You should, oh, this is woman's work. I mean, washing up dishes and things of that kind. They used to say that, and people then say, but no. What are the fundamental, basic rights of a person because this person is human. So maybe we've got to be sensitive.
Hi. If it's not too private of a question, when was the exact moment or instance that you guys remember that you decided that you had to get involved in what was going on in South Africa and all the injustices down there?
Sorry, I didn't hear your
Oh,
question.
can you hear me? We're working. Oh. When was the exact moment that you guys decided that you had to become involved in all the problems that were going on in South Africa?
Well, you know, it's not something like an exact time, exact moment where you suddenly realize that, no, I've got to do this. It's over a number of things. First, you are struck by a particular thing that you think, I won't stand this. And then there comes another one and you say, no, I won't stand that, I won't stand that. And this takes time if you are brought up in a culture as we were in South Africa where things were happening the way they were happening and we were born when they were happening that way. So, you know, you don't have a precise moment and say at that moment. It might be something that happens. Like, for instance, my husband's moment was when the passing of the Bantu Education Act. It wasn't that he suddenly thought, I'm going to be involved now, but that was sort of the last thing because that made him take a stand.
And on the whole, you know, you don't wake up one morning and say, hey, I really am going to take these guys up. As Leah says, frequently it's a series of things that happen, and some you think are coincidences. And you get upset about this, you get upset about the other, and you say, no, I'm fed up to my back teeth kind of thing. And you have a sort of last straw, perhaps, that just turns you. And sometimes maybe not be a very, very, very big thing, but it comes after a lot of other things. Yeah, and then maybe there are, coincidences. In our own case, it was also the influences that you have had. You know, I mean, how no one is really self-made. We are each the result of influences, and it's an awful person who says I'm a self-made person and I worship my maker. You know, that each one of us, well, I certainly know that I owe a very great deal to very, very many people who helped to influence me. And I didn't suddenly sort of discover that I'm opposed to injustice. I had very many role models who made me, you know, one day, I mean, I just woke up maybe and said, yeah, I think I don't want not to be like so-and-so. I want to emulate so-and-so. What do I wish I had known? That I would love her for so long.
Surely playing safe today.
Well, we share a cabin.
Hi. Most people agree that there's a basic human moral code, such as I won't kill another person. What did you discover during the TRC about the lack of that basic human moral code with people that commit acts of human rights violations?
It wasn't that they didn't know. I mean, that is what made it so awful. I mean, the fact that they would now come and confess meant, I mean, that they knew that they were doing something that was wrong. I mean, why hide it? I mean, why hide the fact that you assassinated somebody and then blew up his body? Or you killed someone and you threw his body into a crocodile-infested river. Most of us have a basic sense of morality, you know, and those of you who read philosophy know, I mean, how Kant speaks about the categorical imperative, that there are things that we know, and there are other things that we also get to learn that are wrong. And so it wasn't that these guys, and it mostly was guys. No, very few guys came up as perpetrators. They knew they were doing wrong, and that is why they always hid whatever they did. Because if it was something that they were not ashamed of, they would have blazoned it abroad and said, look, we violate human rights, we assassinate people. They didn't. They knew.
But also one learned was that sometimes to save one's skin, one can do anything. For instance, in the film that we watched yesterday, there was this man who was asked, why did you do it? And his answer was, if I hadn't, where would I have been? I mean, sometimes people do awful things just through fear of either losing a position or being ostracized by family or friends. You know, that's what one also learned from the TRC.
All right, my topic, it might be a little off what you're normally used to discussing, but I was curious if you had any opinions regarding the inclusion of people with disabilities in, like, say, regular education. There's a huge issue in California and lots of places in the United States where there are issues regarding that basically they're discriminated against people with disabilities and that they don't have the right to be included in regular education classrooms, and I was just curious about your opinion on that.
I don't even have to think about it. I mean, why discriminate against them? I mean, most people have disabilities. It's just one of the incredible things. I mean, that especially say if you are in a wheelchair, people think somehow that you must be stupid. You know, I mean, when you're a person with disability, and I learned, I mean, I was in a conference where people were saying language is very powerful and we ought to be very careful, because when you say someone is disabled, then somehow we connect that with a cerebral capacity. And we ought to say somebody with, say, physical disability, because that's about the only thing that is wrong with them. I have this disability, poor eyesight. I wear 2 hearing aids. That's a disability. I have a paralyzed right hand. That's a disability. Nelson Mandela has those disabilities too. I mean, he has to wear glasses. And yet we don't say because of that disability he ought not to be president. Imagine, I mean, if he had not become president. And so, no, for me, I mean, it's almost instinctive. Unfortunately, we have a constitution that outlaws discrimination on any of those grounds, especially on the grounds of disability.
Hi. In our global studies class yesterday, we heard Professor Murphy talk about the original nonviolent resistance to apartheid, and he specifically called it a nonviolence phase. And I'm wondering how you felt about the shift from nonviolent resistance to violent resistance, and maybe how you feel about it now that not that much time has gone by, but now and at the moment when it was happening. How did you react to that?
Well, it's actually in a way fairly straightforward. The struggle was a struggle that fundamentally was a non-violent struggle. And as you know, Mahatma Gandhi started, as it were, his political career in South Africa. And his satyagraha he developed began in South Africa. And our liberation movements, when they were banned in 1960, said, we have been wanting to use nonviolent methods. It's quite clear we are not going to be allowed to do that, and so we continue. I said, and many other people said, we still want to continue our efforts at a non-violent struggle. But that the system itself is a violent system. So if we oppose violence, we are going to have to be saying that the violence of an unjust system and the violence of those who try to overthrow it. And we were saying, when we sought to persuade the West to impose economic sanctions, we said this is the last non-violent strategy. But I mean, we were not particularly successful. Mrs. Thatcher, as she then was totally opposed to sanctions. President Reagan was totally opposed to sanctions. Mercifully, it was young people particularly, not exclusively, but it was young people in the United States, in colleges and universities, who helped to change the moral climate. And Congress then passed the anti-apartheid legislation and even had a veto override, which was a very significant part of our struggle. But you know, the church has developed something called the just war theory, according to which when you have, there are a number of items where you say, is it justifiable to go to war? And you say, have you tried every conceivable non-violent way? And the liberation movement would have said, we have. And then we would have said, well, if sanctions had not been applied, we would have said, we tried, and now we don't think we can go on begging for our freedom as if it were something that is in the gift of white people. Our freedom is not in the gift of white people. Our freedom was, as we said, inalienable, a God-given thing. And so, yeah, we were not pacifists, most of us. There are very few pacifists.
Hi. Throughout your life and even to this day, who have been and who are some of your greatest role models and influences?
Well, I always say my mother. my mother was one of the most important influences in my life.
She was to me too.
She
He had the greatest mom.
she was not educated, I mean, more beyond elementary school. But I often say to people, I resemble her physically. She had a large nose like mine, and she was stumpy. But I said, I hope I resemble her in her temperament. She was incredibly compassionate and cared. Leah gave her a nickname and said she was comforter of the afflicted, because in the family, if people were quarreling, whatever the rights and wrongs of the situation, she sided with the one who was having the worst of it. And yeah, she was the most important. But then there are other people, Trevor Huddleston, who was a priest in Sophiatown and later became Archbishop of the Indian Ocean, and was the president of the anti-apartheid movement. Those were some of the people. What about you?
My question is about the TRC and how you assembled that. I know you had a lot of people from a lot of varieties of backgrounds, religious and ethnic and socioeconomic. And how did you assemble people like Pete Meyering and all those guys? Just how did you pick them?
Well, I didn't, but they asked for the suggestions of names. I mean, people wrote in. The President Mandela appointed a representative panel, and they did something that hadn't happened in South Africa before. But you are used to open hearings, and they must have got maybe something like 300-400 names that were suggested, and that was reduced quite considerably. And then many were then asked to come to public hearings, and the panel would sit, and the panel, as I say, was multi-party, multi-ethnic, multi-everything you could think of.
Interdenominational.
Yes, and you were then put through your paces in a public hearing, and then the panel recommended to the president, I think something like maybe 30 names, from which he was supposed to choose 17. The final decision was the president's, but it was, I mean, he was quite deliberate in ensuring that as many of the constituencies of our country would be represented. Otherwise, an already controversial instrument would become even more so. To make it as acceptable, as widely acceptable as possible, you had to want to make it as representative as you possibly could.
Hi, how threatening do you consider the issue of global overpopulation to be, and do you feel that it's morally acceptable to impose limitations on the number of children that families are allowed to have?
Population explosion.
Yeah. Obviously, the land is still as much as there was when there was Adam and Eve, and there are many more of us now there than there were, and obviously there ought to be a limitation to the number of children one has, but that should not be sort of government rule. I think should not be imposed on people, because some people can take good care of 2 children, others can take good care of 6 children. So I think whereas governments have a right, I mean, they know their populations have a right to limit their populations, but there is also the case of human rights. I mean, I obviously have a right to the number of children I want, considering my ability to take care of those children.
I would say, wouldn't you too, that one of the best ways is persuading people that it is better to go this way than that way, that they could be, they are a great deal more likely to be enthusiastic if you get them on side, rather than if you were to impose restrictions from the top down. But it is quite clear, I mean, that we can't obviously go on. The resources are limited. Space is limited, and it just makes sense to say that we ought to be increasingly careful about our environment, about natural resources, about space.
Thank you.
Hi.
Uh,
I'm not telling.
I understand.
I know you feel me. Okay. As we're all traveling the world, I'm kind of starting to get a good feeling about anti-American sentiment across the globe. And being a major political figure around the world, I was wondering if you have any insight or words of wisdom about our current political situation and the war on terrorism. Sorry, had to do it.
There's no anti-American sentiment really.